We'd been married for 36 years when Harold was suddenly diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But somehow his memory loss seemed to spare everything, except me. Still, I stayed by his side without a word of complaint, caring for him as though nothing had changed. Until today. I overheard him on the phone with an old friend, purely by chance. "You're acting like a stubborn 3-year-old. How does she even put up with you?" Harold's voice was flat, emotionless. "I'm just trying to push her to say it first, to ask for a divorce. Come on, you know Vivian's been struggling on her own all these years, raising kids, moving from place to place. I can't keep her waiting anymore." So that was it. The disease, this whole performance, was just a cover. An excuse to reunite with his old flame. I looked down at the bowl of noodles he'd deliberately spilled, the one I had cooked again and again without complaint. A bitter smile tugged at the corner of my lips. "Fine. If that's what you want, then let's end this." By the 13th time I wiped the grease from the corner of Harold's mouth and lifted the spoon to feed him again, my arms had already started to ache. I picked up a small bite of vegetables, coaxing him softly, "Come on, sweetheart. Just a little bit of veggies, okay?" But Harold turned his head away abruptly like a sulking child and shouted, "No. I'm not eating that." Before I could respond, he jumped to his feet and swung his arm out in frustration. Plates and bowls crashed onto the floor, shattering in all directions. The hot soup splashed onto my feet, sending a sharp sting up my leg and forcing a hiss through my teeth. He froze. There was a flicker of confusion in his eyes, as if somewhere deep down he realized he'd done something wrong. He hesitated, starting to step forward. I bit back the pain and quickly stopped him. "Don't move. Stay right there, the shards could cut you." With the way his mind works now, if he stepped into that mess he could seriously hurt himself. This was my husband, Harold Blake. Once a self-made titan, a force in the investment world, a man who had clawed his way to the top through sheer willpower and brilliance. But a year ago he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. This disease, so silent and relentless, chips away at everything. Memories. Emotions. The ability to control even the simplest actions. But the cruelest part? The first person Harold forgot was me. Harold had stopped lashing out. He just sat there now, his eyes wide and innocent, looking at me as if nothing had happened, like the outburst, the shattered dishes, the scalding soup. None of it had ever occurred. The ache in my chest tightened. Tears threatened to spill, but I swallowed them down, refusing to let them fall. Ignoring the burn on my foot, I guided him gently to the couch and turned on a cartoon to keep him occupied. He sat quietly, eyes fixed on the screen like a child, while I limped off to fetch the broom and dustpan. I knelt down and began sweeping the broken pieces from the floor, each clink of porcelain echoing a kind of quiet grief. Only when I turned on the faucet and let cold water run over my foot did the burning ease slightly. But in that moment another sting rose, one I couldn't wash away. I remembered that morning. The morning I woke up and found Harold staring at me with eyes colder than I'd ever seen. Eyes that didn't recognize me. "Who are you?" he asked, voice sharp and unfamiliar. "What are you doing in my house?" My heart sank. I picked up the phone and immediately called Caleb. The moment our son walked through the door, Harold's face softened. A smile broke across his lips. "Hey buddy. You're home." Caleb looked at me puzzled. He hadn't yet grasped what was happening. Then Harold turned to him and asked, "Who is this woman? Why is she in my house?" That's when we knew something was deeply wrong. Caleb rushed us to the hospital. Dr. Alan Fisher was the one who read Harold's test results. He'd known us for decades. Back when we all still lived in that small town, back when life was simpler and futures felt wide open. "Mrs. Blake." His expression was heavy as he reviewed the scans. "It's okay, Alan," I said before he could go on. "Tell me the truth. I can take it." I hadn't been to college, didn't know all the medical jargon. But I remembered when I was a child, an old man in town suddenly forgot everyone around him. People said it was cancer. He'd had a large lump on his head before he passed. That word haunted me. "As long as he's still alive," I told Dr. Fisher, "I'll take whatever it is." He gave me a gentle smile. "It's not cancer, Jade. Don't worry. But it's something else. Harold has Alzheimer's, a degenerative neurological disorder." I stood there numb. But why would he forget me? Dr. Fisher sighed. "With Alzheimer's, memories don't fade in order. Sometimes the first person a patient forgets is the one they were closest to. The first one he forgot was you, which also means in a way you were the one he loved the most. The one he depended on most. I couldn't bring myself to smile. Not then. Not even now. But those words, the first person he forgot was the one he loved most, became the only excuse I had left to comfort myself in the long days that followed. Every time Harold turned those unfamiliar, piercing eyes on me, eyes that scanned me like I was some kind of intruder, and demanded over and over again, "Who are you? Why are you in my house?" Sometimes even shoving me roughly toward the door. I'd silently repeat Dr. Allen's words in my mind, clinging to them like a lifeline. The first person he forgot was you because you were the one he held dearest. I told myself this was what love meant, standing by someone when everything else falls apart. I couldn't give up on him. I couldn't let him get lost in his past alone. The burn on my foot had dulled to a throb by now. I turned off the faucet, washed my hands and leaned against the sink trying to gather myself. And that's when I felt it, that prickling heat of someone staring at me, sharp and insistent like a needle pressed to my back. I looked up at the mirror. Harold was standing in the doorway. In his 60s now, but still looking like a man in his prime. Thick dark hair, sharp features that still held traces of the handsome face I once fell in love with. He leaned against the doorframe, silent, watching me with wide, clear eyes, the innocent gaze of a child. I exhaled slowly, relieved for a moment. Maybe he was calm again. I started to speak, my voice gentle. "Are you still hungry? I can make you some tomato and egg noodles if you want." But the moment shattered in an instant. His whole demeanor shifted. His voice snapped into something urgent, suspicious. "Who are you? How did you get in here? Are you trying to rob me? Get out. Right now. Or I'm calling security." The floor seemed to drop from beneath me. Before I could even gather my thoughts, Harold lunged forward and shoved me toward the door. His mind might have regressed, but his strength hadn't. I couldn't stop him. I couldn't even slow him down. I didn't even have time to grab my shoes. The door slammed shut behind me. Charleston's winter nights were brutally cold and snow still blanketed the ground in thick layers. My bare feet hit the icy stone path, instantly numb from the cold, the sharp gravel biting into my soles. I rubbed my hands together for warmth, watching each breath curl out in frosty clouds. My phone was still inside the house. I had no choice but to limp toward the community office to get the spare key. Halfway down the path, I spotted the community security patrol heading toward me, a young woman named Ella. The moment she saw me, she stopped in her tracks, eyes wide with understanding. "Mrs. Blake, wait here, I'll grab the spare key for you." She dashed off before I could say a word. Just a few minutes later she came hurrying back, cheeks flushed, carrying a jingling ring of keys, and a pair of thick winter shoes. She gave me an apologetic smile. "Mrs. Blake, if you don't mind, here, wear mine for now. You'll get frostbite out here barefoot." Gratefully I took the shoes and keys, thanking her over and over as we walked back toward the house together. I stood before the front door of our house and knocked firmly. "Harold, open the door." His voice came from inside, low and guarded. "I don't know you. Go away." My tone instinctively sharpened. "I'm your wife. If you don't open this door, I swear I'm going to get really upset." Harold let out a sharp scoff. "Impossible. My wife isn't you." He refused to open the door. There I was, standing outside in the cold with Ella, my face burning with embarrassment as I awkwardly rubbed my hands together to keep warm. Ella sifted through the ring of spare keys, trying one after another, until she finally found the right one. Without hesitation she unlocked the door. The moment it swung open, our eyes met. Harold looked right at me with that same blank, unfamiliar gaze. But he clearly recognized Ella. She stepped forward, speaking firmly like an older sister schooling a stubborn child. "Mr. Blake, a real man doesn't treat a woman this way, right? I'd bet my reputation on it. This woman standing next to me, Mrs. Jade Blake, is your legal wife. You've been married for decades. Don't you remember the 2 drawers under your nightstand? Your marriage certificate's been sitting there all this time. If you don't believe me, go take a look for yourself." Harold shot me a suspicious glance, then turned around and headed to the bedroom. A few minutes later he came back holding a worn marriage certificate in his hand. He stared at the old photo on the document, then looked at me again. His lips curled slightly in reluctant acknowledgement. "Fine. Looks like you really are my wife. Go ahead. Come in." Before Ella handed back the key, she gave him one final look, her voice solemn. "Mr. Blake, a real man doesn't push a woman out into the cold." Harold didn't say a word. He just turned and went back to the living room, tossing the marriage certificate carelessly onto the floor before sinking into the couch to watch his cartoons. I bent down, picked it up, and quietly went back to the bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at that photo for a long time. It had been taken a few years ago. I was smiling like a fool, not much different from how I looked now. We'd been together for over 30 years and had raised a son, but ironically, it wasn't until 6 years ago that we made it official. I'd brought it up a few times over the years, asking if we could just take a trip down to City Hall. But Harold always had an excuse. Too busy with work, too many meetings, the timing was never right. Whenever I mentioned it again at home, he'd just pull me close and say, "You're already my wife. We don't need some piece of paper to prove it." I used to find that romantic. Eventually, I learned to settle for it. It wasn't until our son got married that we finally walked into City Hall and signed that piece of paper. The title I'd chased half my life, the unnecessary fuss Harold always dismissed, had finally become a name recognized by law. I still remember that day so vividly, standing with Harold at City Hall signing our marriage license. It was a quiet moment, but the joy inside me was overwhelming, almost too much to put into words. And yet now, 36 years into our marriage, Harold has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He's forgotten so much, especially everything about me. It's supposed to be him lost in the fog of memory. But sometimes, it feels like I'm the one trapped in a time capsule, watching everything pass me by while standing perfectly still. That evening, Caleb came home for a rare visit, bringing Nina and little Liam with him. Ever since Harold's diagnosis, Caleb has taken over the company, juggling one responsibility after another. The endless stress has started to show. Those once jet black strands in his hair now had a few stubborn threads of gray peeking through. Nina, meanwhile, barely had time to breathe. She spent most of her days chasing after the whirlwind energy of a toddler, with no space left for herself. Knowing how exhausting life had been for them, I'd spent the entire morning cooking up a full table of dishes, hoping to give them a taste of home and a bit of comfort. When we all finally sat down to eat, Harold pulled his chair closer to Caleb, so close in fact it felt deliberate. A small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The distance, the wariness. It was as if I were just another stranger at the table. Liam scrunched up his face and mumbled, "Grandpa, you're squishing me." Caleb glanced at me, visibly uncomfortable, then turned to his father and whispered, "Dad, come on. Mom's not a stranger, and definitely not the enemy. She understands you. Don't push her away like this." Harold kept his head down, saying nothing. Me. I just sat there, my heart already tightening even before the first bite. They chatted and laughed together, a warm, intimate circle of family. From the outside it looked like a picture-perfect dinner. Only I wasn't part of it. I was just on the edge, unseen, uninvited, and achingly alone. It would be a lie to say it didn't hurt. Still, I forced a smile and reached across the table to serve everyone some ribs. "Eat up while it's hot," I said cheerfully. "Next time you come home, I'll make another pot for you." Back when we were younger, Harold was always on the road, traveling for business, flying down south to close deals. Every time he returned, I'd make him a pot of braised ribs. It became our ritual. Caleb was just a little boy back then. At night, he'd sneak over to the phone and dial Harold's number, his small voice echoing through the hallway. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" After dinner, I headed into the kitchen to clear the table and wash the dishes. I was halfway through when I glanced down and noticed Harold's empty bowl. He'd eaten everything except the ribs. That single piece of meat lay untouched, left behind as if it didn't belong. And suddenly something tugged at my chest, sharp and aching, a hollow knot rising straight to my throat. Nina came in quietly and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Jade," she said softly, "don't take it to heart. Harold's just like a child now. He can't tell closeness from distance anymore." I nodded, forcing down the lump in my throat, and silently went back to scrubbing dishes, letting the sound of running water drown out the ache in my heart. After tucking the kids into bed and wrapping up another long day, I still couldn't sit still. My hands, almost by habit now, reached for the cleaning cloth as I started wiping down the house again. Ever since Harold's diagnosis, we'd gone through several caregivers. But none of them lasted long. He'd either fly into sudden rages or throw tantrums over the smallest things. One by one they all left. In the end it was just me. I was the only one left who could handle him, the only one who still tried. As I wiped down the cabinets, my eyes drifted toward the bedroom. Harold was lying on his side, unmoving, his gaze fixed intently on the cloth in my hand. I moved closer to his desk, intending to wipe the surface, when he suddenly sat up and said sharply, "Don't touch that." Startled, I froze. He walked over quickly and picked up a photo frame sitting on the desk. Harold returned to the bed, cradling the photo in his hands, his eyes lost in a distant memory. And then, unexpectedly, a faint smile curled at the corner of his lips, a rare expression these days. He stared at the photograph for a long time, then gently wiped the dust from the glass with his sleeve, almost reverently. Finally, he set it down carefully on his nightstand, placing it with a kind of solemn care he hadn't shown for anything else in years. That photo, he'd always held it dear. Everything else in the house could be moved or replaced, but not that frame. Anyone who even dared to touch it would instantly see his temper flare. Under the dim, warm glow of the bedroom light, the image inside had begun to fade. But I remembered exactly what was in that picture. A group of young people, vibrant and full of life, stood shoulder to shoulder on a dusty country road, their smiles bright and carefree. At the bottom of the photo, a small caption was printed. Community Volunteer Program, 1979 Group Photo. Right in the center stood Harold, and the woman beside him, Vivian Moore. That year, Vivian had come to our small town as a university student, part of the Community Volunteer Program. She was smart, striking, and carried herself with the unmistakable air of someone raised in the city, confident, polished, and a little condescending, whether she meant to be or not. Harold, on the other hand, was the pride of our town. His family didn't have much. His parents worked at a local factory, but he was driven, clever, ambitious. Everyone knew he was going places. Tall, good-looking, respectful, he was the kind of young man every girl in town quietly dreamed about. But me, I didn't bother hiding it. I liked him openly and wholeheartedly. My grandfather was the head of the town's community committee, so keeping my feelings a secret wasn't exactly an option. I used to bring Harold lunch and nag him about finishing his assignments. In the evenings while he attended night school, I'd sneak into the back of the classroom just to hear him read aloud. But everything changed when Vivian arrived. She and Harold were closer in age, shared a similar education, and seemed to speak the same language. They'd spend hours together in the library, sitting side by side, discussing poetry and exchanging their favorite books. I had nothing to contribute, just sat on the sidelines watching them, the unease inside me growing stronger with every passing day. I even tried to find out what kind of girls Harold liked. Someone said he admired girls who were simple and clean with ponytails. So I started wearing my hair in a ponytail every day, swinging it back and forth in front of him, hoping he'd notice. Then one day while I was delivering lunch, I overheard a few city girls chatting and laughing. "Have you seen Jade lately? She's been copying everything Vivian does. It's pathetic. Her hair's so thin and stringy like it's barely hanging on. Who is she trying to impress?" I stood in the corner, cheeks burning, biting my lips so hard I thought it might bleed. And then a cool, composed voice cut through their giggles. "Don't say that. Jade is Harold's little sister. If he hears you talking like that, he won't be pleased." It was Vivian. She let out a soft cough and added, ever so gently, "She's just a small-town girl. It's only natural that she's no match for me. But don't say such things in front of her. It won't reflect well on you." I peeked through the window and saw her expression. She was smiling politely, but beneath that sweetness was a cold, condescending glint. "She's so plain and chubby, always clinging to Harold like a stray. It's honestly embarrassing." Harold had fallen asleep clutching that photo in his arms. I lifted the corner of the blanket gently and slid into bed beside him, careful not to disturb him. It was a cold night, but I didn't dare move any closer. He still saw me as a stranger, distant, suspicious, unwilling to let me near. I kept telling myself, he's sick. You can't take this personally. You can't blame a patient for their illness. But somewhere in the haze of the night I started feeling feverish. Maybe I'd caught a chill during the day, now it felt like it was settling into my bones. Sometime after midnight, Harold suddenly shoved me awake, grumbling from the other side of the bed that he was hungry. He insisted I get up and make him something to eat. My head throbbed, my body ached, but he kept complaining like a cranky child, refusing to let it go. So I forced myself out of bed and dragged my aching body into the kitchen. I made a quick serving of creamy macaroni and cheese and brought it to him. He took one bite, just one, and knocked the entire bowl off the tray. Pasta and sauce splattered across the floor. Thankfully, I had cooked an extra portion, one I'd planned to eat myself. I reheated it for him without a word. He took 2 bites this time, then wrinkled his nose in disdain. "I want chicken noodle soup instead." I sighed in exhaustion. Thankfully, I had some leftover broth from a couple of days ago. I pulled myself together and got back to work, cooking up a fresh bowl of soup and bringing it to him. He took a few sips, then frowned again. "I don't want this either." I closed my eyes for a second, trying to hold back the frustration rising in my chest. "Forget it," he muttered. "Just turn on the TV, I want to see cartoons." His behavior was getting worse, more demanding, more petulant. Afraid he'd wake Caleb and his family, I turned on the TV in the bedroom and lowered the volume. Then I returned to the kitchen to clean up the mess on the floor. But as I made my way back toward the bedroom, I noticed something strange. The volume on the television had been turned all the way up. Loud, jarring voices filled the hallway. And through that noise I heard something else, Harold's voice. I slowed my steps, careful not to make a sound, and stepped quietly toward the door. He wasn't watching TV anymore. He was on the balcony, phone pressed to his ear, speaking with a clarity and sharpness I hadn't seen in months. There was no confusion, no mental fog, no childlike daze. His posture was firm. His voice, cold, calm, deliberate. I leaned in closer, barely breathing. On the other end of the line, someone chuckled. "The way you're acting lately, throwing fits like a toddler. How does your wife even put up with you?" Harold responded flatly. "That's the point. I want to push her to the edge, to make her snap first. I want her to be the one to ask for a divorce. You know, Vivian's been on her own for years, raising her kid alone, struggling to get by. I can't keep her waiting." There was a pause on the other end. Said, "Still, is that really fair to Jade? She's just a traditional housewife. Her whole life has been about you. She doesn't know the law, doesn't know how to protect herself. You really want to force her into a divorce like this? Wouldn't it be better if you just told her yourself? At least that way she could walk away with a little dignity." Silence. And then everything inside me collapsed. So this was it. Harold wasn't sick at all. The Alzheimer's, the memory loss, the confusion, the tantrums, it was all an act. He just wanted to push me away. He wanted me to leave so he could go back to Vivian without guilt, without blame, without consequence. I stood frozen by the door, my body trembling uncontrollably. So this is what it all came down to. Everything, every tear I held back, every meal I cooked, every humiliation I endured, it was all just a stage for his clean exit. A tidy excuse to make room for an old love. Me. I had been clinging to a marriage that was already gone. 36 years. And in the end I was the only one still trying. Something inside me broke. The last of my strength gave out and the room began to spin. The bowl of soup in my hands slipped through my fingers and shattered on the floor, broth and noodles spilling across the tiles. Before my vision went completely dark, I thought I saw Harold rushing toward me. But maybe that was just a dream, because in all the years I'd loved him, that was the first time I'd ever seen him run to me. The hospital ceiling was a stark, lifeless white, and the sharp sting of disinfectant hung heavy in the air. My arm ached faintly beneath the floor. "Mom, you're awake." Caleb and Nina were seated by my bedside, watching over me. Harold stood silently by the door, his expression cold and unreadable. For a moment I wished I could close my eyes and wake up somewhere else. Anywhere but here. I wanted this to be just a nightmare, something I could forget. "You're awake." Harold stepped closer to the bed, his tone flat as if he were commenting on the weather. There was no guilt in his eyes. Not even a flicker. Just quiet indifference. Like this was all expected, like he wasn't even trying to keep up the charade anymore. He didn't bother pretending. And I couldn't understand it. How could he be this cruel? I had given my entire life to this man, poured every piece of myself into this marriage, and he stood there acting like none of it ever mattered. I didn't even realize I was crying until the tears had already soaked my cheeks. Let's get a divorce," Harold said, cutting me off before I could speak. His voice was detached, as if he were offering a weather forecast instead of ending a marriage. "Honestly," he added casually, "I was hoping you'd be the one to say it first." And then he turned around and walked out of the room. Caleb and Nina exchanged a glance. No one said a word. I sat there in silence, numb. Only then did it truly hit me, Harold's phone call on the balcony that night. He wanted me to hear it. The whole act, his so-called illness, had been a lie. A carefully crafted performance, a role he played until the script got too messy. So he simply walked off stage. And I was left behind, choking on the wreckage of a story I thought we were still writing together. The sobs came fast and uncontrollably. I buried my face in my hands and let them tear through me. Caleb reached over, placing a tentative hand on my shoulder. Mom, don't take it too hard. Maybe Dad didn't mean to hurt you. I lifted my head abruptly, my voice shaking. You knew, didn't you? You knew he was faking it. His eyes flickered and his fingers brushed his nose, his old tell whenever he lied. Of course not, Mom, he said too quickly. I only just found out too. And yeah, what he did was awful. He stood up, avoiding my gaze. I need to head back to the office. Nina, can you stay with Mom a little longer? Make sure she gets some rest. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his coat and left. I watched the door slowly close behind him, and in that moment I felt the last pieces of me fall apart. Hollow. Even my own son had chosen Harold's side. They'd planned this together, worked out every angle, just to push me to say those two words first. I want a divorce. Nina stayed seated beside me. She quietly picked up a fruit knife and began peeling an apple, the soft scrape of blade against skin the only sound in the room. What Harold did, it's unforgivable, she said softly. But please try not to let it break you. Your health matters more than anything right now. I didn't have the heart to eat, but she placed a tissue beneath the sliced apple and gently set it on the nightstand anyway. You should try to get some rest, she said. Liam's probably waking up soon. I need to take him to school. I nodded, voice low. Go ahead. I'll be fine. She grabbed her bag and gave me a quiet smile before slipping out the door. But as the silence settled in again, I stared at the empty room, at the untouched apple, at the door she left swinging gently behind her. And I asked myself the question I couldn't answer. Will I really be fine? Will I truly be okay on my own? I suppose I'd sensed it long before everything fell apart, that Harold had never truly cut ties with Vivian. Started a few years back, subtle at first. He'd receive phone calls at odd hours, calls he always took with a strange flickering look in his eyes. As soon as the phone rang, he'd glance at me, then either step outside with his coat or slip quietly into the garden to talk, keeping his voice low and his back turned. Old friend, I'd ask, trying to sound casual. He'd pause for just a beat too long before offering a stiff smile. Yeah, just an old friend catching up. But eventually the signs became harder to ignore. He started reorganizing his closet frequently, getting rid of old clothes and replacing them with trendier, more youthful styles. Once, while glancing at his phone, I accidentally caught sight of an unsent email draft. Just one line in the subject bar. I'm sorry for all these years. And then there was the plane ticket. He'd returned from a business trip one weekend and for once forgot to empty his coat pockets. I found the ticket while doing laundry. The destination wasn't Chicago like he'd told me. It was Los Angeles. I never confronted him about it. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Maybe I was just too used to swallowing things whole and smiling through the bitterness. Harold's friend wasn't wrong. I was exactly that kind of woman, the kind who built her entire world around home and family. When I was younger, I took on odd jobs here and there. Some sewing gigs, a little bookkeeping just to help cover expenses. But eventually I let it all go. I gave everything to this family. I became a full-time homemaker, pouring my energy into my husband, my son, and the life we built around them. Out there, I was the kind of woman who would argue passionately with a neighbor if they offended my family. At the grocery store, I'd fight over a few cents with the cashier if I thought I was right. At home, I patched old clothes late into the night, stitch by stitch, because I couldn't bear to throw anything away. I'd never had any formal education, let alone any grasp of the law. When I stepped into corporate buildings or law offices, I shrank into myself, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, feeling like I didn't belong. I cried beside that hospital bed for hours, tears pouring out like water from a broken dam, until a nurse finally came in to remove the four from my arm. I walked out of that hospital in a daze, still clutching that withered apple Nina had left for me. Its skin had turned a soft shade of brown, oxidized and limp. Outside, snow had begun to fall. The streets were silent, empty, dusted and white. I wandered without direction, my feet carrying me as if they had a mind of their own. Eventually I found myself at the Riverside Park. The wind had picked up but I barely felt it anymore. My body had grown cold but somehow I couldn't register the chill. I sat on a weathered metal bench, its icy surface creaking beneath my weight. The lake had begun to freeze over. A thin layer of ice shimmered on its surface, quiet and untouched. I stared at it and for the first time in a long time my mind felt still. There was no grief, no rage, only an eerie calm as if something deep within me had simply gone quiet. And in that silence, a strange thought surfaced, unbidden, impossible to shake. As if something, or someone was calling me. I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there. My legs had gone numb from the cold by the time I finally stood up. "Whoa, ma'am, I thought you were a bonfire from a distance." A young woman jumped into view, her appearance as striking as her voice. Piercings on her face, a quirky outfit and a guitar case slung over her shoulder. She circled me playfully, studying me from head to toe. "This red sweater of yours is just..." She dragged out the last word, letting it hang in the air. I instinctively asked, "What about it?" She grinned brightly. "It's beautiful. It's got real character. Can you send me the link?" I blinked, confused. The link?" She laughed. "I mean, where'd you buy it?" She had that kind of energy, effortless, warm, and so familiar, like we'd known each other for years instead of minutes. "I'm Eleanor Thompson," she said cheerfully, tossing her hair back. "I sing at a lounge just a few blocks from here. You want to come listen to some music with me?" I was about to decline politely, but she was too enthusiastic, didn't even give me a chance to say no. I glanced back at the apple I'd left on the bench. It looked dull and shriveled now, tinged with brown. After a brief hesitation, I left it there and followed her down the street. We walked 2 or 3 blocks, winding past dim storefronts and sleepy intersections, until we reached a small neon sign that read Live Acoustic Lounge. I hesitated outside. I'd assumed this would be one of those places where young people danced wildly and the music pounded loud enough to rattle your bones. But the moment we stepped inside, I realized how wrong I'd been. The lighting was soft and warm, casting gentle shadows over a few scattered tables. A handful of patrons sipped drinks and chatted quietly. In the corner, mellow jazz drifted from a speaker, low and soothing. My eyes widened. Eleanor caught the look on my face and chuckled. "You thought this was a dance club, didn't you? Don't worry, we'll save that for another night," she teased. "This place is more of a listening bar, low-key and easy on the ears." She unslung her guitar and set it down beside the small stage. "Give me a minute, you're about to hear me play." Before I could respond, she handed me a cup of hot water and climbed the few steps to the stage. She adjusted her tuning and began to strum a soft, melodic folk song. Her voice floated through the room, gentle, earthy, and warm. It wrapped around each note like wind curling through tall grass, settling into the air with effortless grace. When she finished, she jumped down from the stage and dropped into the seat beside me again. She ordered a cocktail that looked like something from a painting. Sunset orange on the bottom, emerald green on top, the two colors pressed tightly together like they were trying not to blend. She took a slow sip and made a face. "Don't let the color fool you," she said, tapping the glass. "It tastes as weird as it looks. Bitter first, then sweet." She snapped her fingers and the bartender brought another glass, an identical one, for me. I stared at the drink for a moment, curious. Finally, I took a cautious sip. He was right. The bitterness hit first, sharp and jarring, but the sweetness that followed was unexpected. Smooth, slow, and lingering, it softened everything that came before, until all that remained was a quiet warmth. And for the first time in what felt like years, I realized, maybe not everything bitter has to stay bitter. I dragged my weary body through the door, stepping into a house that suddenly felt colder than ever. The quiet pressed down like a heavy blanket. I scanned the living room and for the first time, I noticed how little in this home actually belonged to me. A few picture frames on the wall, a worn throw pillow I'd picked out years ago. Nothing more. Everything else was his, theirs, or simply not mine. I sank into the couch, letting my back rest against the cushions and exhaled slowly. My fingers reached for my phone out of habit. The screen lit up, dozens of missed calls. Most from Caleb and Nina, a few from Harold's number. I was just about to call back when the phone rang again. "Harold." I hesitated, then answered. His voice came through tense and anxious. Where did you go? The hospital room was empty. How could you just wander off like that? Caleb's voice piped in, even more panicked. Mom, please don't scare us like this. Don't do anything rash, okay? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my emotions lodged somewhere deep in my chest. All I could manage was a soft murmur. I went home. I ended the call, staring blankly at the screen as it went dark. My brows furrowed and I leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I didn't move. Didn't think. Just sat in the silence, letting it settle around me like dust. It wasn't until dusk that they came rushing through the front door. Harold looked like he'd just come from work. Of course he had. After all the time he spent faking illness, someone had to return to the office and clean up the mess. Caleb couldn't manage it all alone. As soon as they stepped inside, Caleb's tone carried a trace of frustration. Mom, why didn't you turn the lights on? It's already dark. I didn't answer. He must have assumed I was still upset. Come on, Mom. It's really not that big of a deal. Dad's under a lot of pressure too. And Vivian, she's not some villain. She's had a tough time too. I turned sharply toward him, eyes wide. What was that supposed to mean? Was I suddenly the unreasonable one here? The woman who manipulated her way back into my husband's life, the woman they all lied to protect, was now the one deserving sympathy? I let out a laugh. A hollow, bitter laugh that even I didn't recognize coming from myself. Harold shot me a cold glance. So, you're not even cooking dinner now? Living like this is impossible. His words were meant to cut, to provoke. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I lowered my gaze, strangely calm inside. Harold still thought I'd keep clinging. That I'd drag this miserable marriage on forever. That I'd never be the one to say the words he'd been baiting me toward for months. That I was just a woman too stubborn to let go. Too proud to step aside for his perfect little love story. But he was wrong. I'd finally seen it clearly. This marriage I fought so hard to hold together, this family I sacrificed so much to protect, these emotions I thought I couldn't live without. If they were never really mine to begin with, then it was time to let them go. I looked up, my voice soft but steady. I agreed to the divorce. Let's be done with it. Maybe it was time to stop mourning the life I'd built for someone else, and start finding the one I could build for myself. What did you just say? Say that again. Harold's voice shot up, sharp and incredulous, his face twisted in disbelief. Caleb's eyes widened, stunned as if he hadn't heard me correctly. I said, I agree to the divorce. I spoke slowly, clearly, without a hint of hesitation. And just like that, in the thick of the silence that followed, the doorbell rang. The uninvited guest had arrived. Harold didn't even try to keep up the act anymore. His mask was off, and the so-called old friend entered with all the confidence of someone who knew she had every right to be there. Vivian walked in carrying a grocery bag, acting as if this were her home. And honestly, if Harold hadn't given her permission, I would have never believed she'd dare show up like this. So bold, so sure of her place. I smiled faintly, watching her move about the house without the slightest hesitation. Vivian strolled into the kitchen, tossing her coat over a chair as if it were second nature. Then she returned to the living room, standing beside Harold with a bright, polished smile. Jade, I heard you weren't feeling well. I figured you all might not have eaten yet, so I brought some things to cook dinner. I hope you don't mind. Her tone was sweet, rehearsed, almost comically proper. I shrugged. Why would I mind? After all, I'd already made up my mind. I wasn't going to play the unpaid housekeeper in this story anymore. Vivian's smile widened, blooming with self-satisfaction. She wore a pale green dress that hugged her figure perfectly, a tailored wool coat draped over her shoulders, her hair neatly twisted into an elegant chignon. Not a single detail out of place, she still wore that age-proof poise like a second skin. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, that old, familiar sense of superiority simmering beneath her polished exterior. That look that said, you never measured up to me and you never will. She took over the kitchen like it had always been hers. Harold trailed after her, assisting with a natural ease that spoke volumes. Caleb, meanwhile, had shut himself away in the study, busying himself with work. I turned and walked to the bedroom, pulling out the suitcase I hadn't touched in years. I began packing. The suitcase wasn't even full, but for the first time in decades I felt light, unburdened. When I wheeled it back into the living room, the dining table was already set, dishes steaming, the air thick with the scent of spices. Vivian emerged from the kitchen, still wearing an apron, beaming as if she'd just won something. "Jade, I remember you used to like bold flavors. Come try some, I just finished." She spoke like she belonged there, like she was the rightful woman of this house. Then with an exaggerated pout she turned to Harold. "Harold, help me untie this apron, it's way too tight." He stepped forward without hesitation, his hands moving familiarly around her waist. My eyes burned, tears pricking behind my lashes, but I still smiled. I clutched the handle of my suitcase and looked at them calmly. "Harold, make time to finalize the divorce papers." And I walked out. Behind me I heard Vivian's voice, soft with feigned concern. "Did I do something wrong? Is she upset with me?" Harold groaned, pulling out a chair with a loud, scraping noise. "Don't bother with her. She's lost it. She'll come crawling back, just wait." I didn't look back. But in that moment I knew one thing for certain. I would never crawl back again. I followed the address on Eleanor's business card, standing hesitantly at the front door, unsure if I should knock. Before I could decide, the door swung open. "There you are." Eleanor beamed, her face lighting up with delight. "I was starting to worry you weren't coming." I offered a slightly awkward smile. "I'll pay rent, of course, at least until I find a place of my own." She waved her hand dismissively. "Please. That's nothing. Honestly, just having someone to keep this lonely soul company is payment enough." Her exaggerated tone made me laugh in spite of myself. She took my suitcase and ushered me inside with her usual warmth. She had already prepared a cozy little bedroom for me, fresh sheets, a neatly made bed, and everything in perfect order. "The closet's empty, so feel free to use it. And toiletries are in the top cabinet in the bathroom," she said, leaning against the doorframe with a playful grin. "Actually, why don't we just be roommates?" she added, eyes twinkling. "You cook, I wash dishes, we'll split the work 70-30. Oh, and I should probably mention there's a cat." I looked down to find an orange tabby weaving between my feet, its soft fur brushing against my ankle. Something warm rose in my chest, gentle, sudden, and overwhelming. I nearly teared up. Eleanor must have noticed. She smiled broadly, then grabbed her coat. "I'll run out and pick up a few groceries." As she left, I began unpacking, folding clothes into drawers, placing little things in their new places. And then my phone rang. It was Dr. Alan Fisher, the very doctor who had first told me Harold was sick. "Jade," he said, his voice lined with concern. "I heard you two are getting divorced? At your age, is that really necessary? You've been together so many years. Harold wasn't a bad husband. Think about it. Maybe you should just go home, apologize, patch things up. Life doesn't have to get this messy." I held the phone tightly, steadying my breath. "Alan, you know Vivian's back. Harold wants a divorce so he can give her a proper place in his life. I'm just giving him what he wanted. This marriage was something I held together alone for years. Now I'm ready to let go." There was a pause on his end. "But he cared about you, Jade. If he didn't, why would he have married you in the first place?" His question hit me harder than I expected. Why did Harold marry me? Truth be told, I'd never really figured that out. I grew up without parents. My grandfather, the town's community committee chairman, raised me. I was bold and headstrong even back then, chasing Harold openly when most girls only dared to admire him from a distance. Everyone in town knew I liked him. And Grandpa never stopped me. If anything, he encouraged me with a proud smile. "Loving someone isn't wrong, Jade," he used to say. "But forcing someone to love you, that's where people go astray." At the time, I didn't understand the weight of his words. But Grandpa always told me, "Remember this, Jade, everything I say comes from life experience." He'd ruffle my hair and say with certainty, "If you love someone, go after them. Don't be afraid to look foolish." With his backing, I grew bold, maybe too bold. I shut out every girl who tried to get close to Harold. I guarded him fiercely, claimed space where I could, did everything to prove I belonged beside him. But the one thing I couldn't stop was Harold's own quiet signals, to someone else. I still remember that letter. That carefully written love letter Harold spent months drafting, the one I eventually, unknowingly, delivered to Vivian myself. My hands had trembled when I realized what I'd done. And yet back then I still believed that if I just held on tightly enough, he'd eventually choose me. Now I knew better. Harold once told me I was the person he trusted most. He handed me a letter one day and said it was important, something that could determine his future. He wanted me to deliver it personally to a specific address. I didn't hesitate. I took the letter and followed his instructions without question. But when I arrived, it wasn't some office or mailbox waiting for me. It was Vivian and a few of her friends. I froze, confused, instinctively turning to leave. One of them called out, "You're here to deliver a letter from Harold, aren't you?" Panic rose in my chest. I tried to play it off, shaking my head, pretending they had the wrong person. But my nerves gave me away. Someone stepped forward and snatched the letter right out of my hands, sneering as she did. "Wow. He really trusts you, huh? But even if you peeked, you probably couldn't understand a word of it anyway, not with your level of education." Laughter broke out around me. They tore the envelope open and began reading the letter aloud, line by line, like it was some kind of show. "Dear Vivian, you are the sunshine of April, gently warming the corners of my world. I like you. Would you be willing to be with me?" They erupted into teasing and giggles. Vivian blushed, her friends nudging her forward, urging her to respond. I stood in the background, my face burning, eyes stinging with tears I couldn't hold back. I turned and ran, humiliated, heartbroken, sobbing all the way home. At the time I told myself it was inevitable. They were a perfect match. Talented, beautiful, from the same world. Of course they'd end up together. But to my surprise, Vivian turned him down. She'd received a notice to return to the city for a job assignment. She had to leave the town behind. When the day of her departure came, Harold didn't even show up to see her off. He stayed locked in his room, disappearing into silence. The next day something shifted. He showed up outside my window, standing there without saying a word, just watching. Eventually he knocked on the door. "Jade," he said quietly, "would you sit with me and read for a while?" Without hesitation I agreed. We fell back into our old rhythm, sitting side by side at the table, reading, laughing. Those moments felt like a second chance, a gentle return to something I thought was gone forever. A few months later, word came that Vivian had married someone in the city, and was already expecting a child. She seemed to be living a good life. I hesitated, unsure whether to tell Harold. When I finally did, he didn't even flinch. His expression was blank. "What does that have to do with me?" His cold indifference brought me an unexpected flicker of joy. If she no longer mattered to him, maybe I still stood a chance. And from there, everything fell into place. Eventually I became Mrs. Blake, just as I'd always dreamed. When my grandfather fell ill, he called Harold to his bedside. "Jade's the one I worry about the most," he said, his voice frail. "Harold, promise me you'll take care of her. For life." Harold nodded. Only then did Grandpa close his eyes in peace. "But oh Grandpa, you were always so good at reading people, except this once. In the end you still got him wrong." Later Harold was admitted to college. Me. I went to work in a factory, taking on long shifts in the heat and grime, earning enough money to support his studies. My skin grew rough and sun-darkened, my hands calloused from labor. But every night I thought of him, wondering if he had enough to eat, if he was warm, if he was okay. I only visited him once during those years. I'd scraped together an entire year's worth of tuition and living expenses, stuffing it into an envelope before boarding a train that took 3 full days to reach his city. When I finally saw him again, he was walking through campus in a plaid shirt, books under one arm, chatting with classmates, his face lit with the earnest glow of youth. At that moment I felt all my exhaustion melt away. I called his name. He turned, startled. When he saw me, a flicker of surprise crossed his face before he quickly led me outside the gate. "I told you, you could have just mailed the money. Why come all this way?" I looked up at him with a sheepish smile. "I missed you," I said softly. "I just wanted to see if you were doing okay, if you were eating enough, staying warm." That was all I wanted back then, just a glimpse of his world, a moment in his day, a place somewhere in his heart. Maybe it was that foolish persistence of mine that finally moved Harold. Maybe that's the only reason he chose to walk this road with me back then. I let out a quiet sigh. The divorce. It's for the best, for both of us. Why did Harold marry me in the first place? Perhaps it was a mix of disappointment over his so-called true love, a sense of obligation after my grandfather's final plea, and maybe even a flicker of guilt for how I worked my hands raw just to put him through school. It took me years, but I've finally come to terms with it. After spending a few days at Eleanor's place, I started to feel steady again. I'd found my footing. And so, I decided it was time to go see Harold. One last time. I packed the divorce papers and the property settlement agreement and for the first time in my life, stepped into that towering office building I used to think was far beyond my reach. The security guard at the front desk stopped me right away. "Ma'am, who are you here to see? Do you have an appointment?" I shook my head calmly. "I'm here to see Harold Blake. I'm his wife. I'm here to discuss our divorce." The words fell into the air like a dropped glass. Heads turned instantly. Employees nearby glanced up, their eyes filled with curiosity, gossip already churning in low murmurs that rippled through the lobby like a rising tide. "Wait, isn't the boss's wife that woman in the pencil skirts who's always walking around the office like she owns the place? Who's this? Seriously? She's Mrs. Blake? She doesn't look the part. Her outfit's so plain. Oh my God, this is wild." I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled out the folder from my bag, flipped it open, and held up our old marriage certificate for everyone to see. The lobby erupted. And right on cue, Caleb burst out of the elevator, eyes wide the moment he saw me. "Mom? What are you doing here?" I gave him a composed smile. "I came to get a divorce." Harold appeared next, and almost theatrically, Vivian stepped in right behind him. Perfectly timed, perfectly poised, playing the part of the wounded woman standing quietly by her man's side. The murmurs grew louder, more chaotic. "Whoa, this is like something out of a drama. The wife, the mistress. This is getting too real. So, who's the real Mrs. Blake now?" Harold's expression darkened as he scanned the crowd. "Enough," he snapped. People scattered instantly. I handed him the folder. He opened it, and the moment his eyes landed on the words divorce agreement, his lips curled into a cold, condescending smile. Well, you really know how to put on a show," he sneered. "How the hell did you figure all this out?" I raised a brow. So that's what he meant by all this? The terms of the property settlement? Did he really think I'd be clueless forever? That I'd beg to stay, humiliate myself, plead for scraps? Or maybe he never imagined I'd beat him to the finish line. He didn't know Eleanor had opened my eyes. She was the one who reminded me, this isn't the old world anymore. Divorce isn't a man's game. His word doesn't dictate the outcome. He even connected me with a lawyer. A sharp one. Together we drafted the agreement line by line, spelling out every clause with clarity and precision. Harold's face tightened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. With a mocking edge to his voice, he muttered, "You actually have friends now?" I met his gaze without flinching. "I do now." It was true. For years I'd revolved around this family, pouring every ounce of energy into it while never truly having a life of my own, let alone a friend. But that chapter was over. Vivian stepped forward just in time, her voice soft and saccharine. "Jade, don't take it the wrong way. Harold's just worried about you. He doesn't want you getting mixed up with the wrong crowd." I looked at her perfectly made-up face, that gentle tone, the polished grace she always wore like armor. But beneath it I saw her clearly for what she was. She was the wrong crowd. I cut her off, my voice firm with impatience. "I don't need your concern, and I certainly don't need your advice on who I should be friends with. I'm perfectly capable of making that judgment myself. My life doesn't need either of you dictating how I should live it." I pulled out a document from my bag, my tone crisp and final. "The divorce agreement is ready. Let's take it straight to the courthouse. I have other things to do, don't waste my time. I'm trying to start a new life." Caleb stepped forward and grabbed my arm, his expression tense. "Mom, don't do this. I know Dad was wrong, but he deserves a chance to pursue his happiness too." I yanked my arm free, my voice cold and cutting. "I don't have a son who takes someone else's side over mine." Looking at him, standing there like a neutral mediator, rational and detached, I felt a wave of nausea. So cleanly, so easily he turned away from me. And in that moment I truly regretted bringing him into this world. Harold stood off to the side, his jaw twitching slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, his tone shifted into something eerily calm. "Fine. If you're that determined, let's go file the papers. Just don't come back saying you regret it." Regret? I was far past the age of regret. We scheduled a court appointment and followed the formal procedure. With lawyers present, the agreement was submitted and reviewed. The judge verified both signatures, confirmed the terms, and then stamped and signed the final decree. And just like that, I had it in my hands. The official divorce judgment. As I stepped out of the courthouse, I exhaled slowly, the weight on my chest finally lifting. The heaviness I'd been carrying for years was gone. Harold walked beside me in silence, his eyes cast downward. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I could imagine. Maybe satisfaction. Maybe a strange emptiness. Maybe for the first time, it hit him that this wasn't just a convenient escape. It was an ending. One he couldn't undo. He slid his hands into his pockets and muttered, "Where are you headed? I'll give you a ride." It was the first time in years he'd offered to take me anywhere. I turned to him, my voice even. "No thank you." My tone was cool, my message crystal clear. I had nothing left to say to him and not a single drop of energy to waste. After the divorce, I started looking for work. But the job market wasn't exactly kind to a woman in her 50s. I applied at a few restaurants. The managers scanned my resume politely, then gently let me down. "You have a lot of life experience, ma'am, but we're looking for someone a little younger." At a local supermarket, I tried for a cashier job. I couldn't even figure out the register system before they quietly told me, "We'll give you a call if anything opens up." It wasn't surprising. But I didn't let it crush me either. I'd found the courage to walk away from a life I no longer recognized. Whatever hurdles lay ahead, I could face them too. That evening, I returned home and snapped a photo of the divorce decree. I sent it to Eleanor. She called within seconds. "Oh my God, congratulations. Welcome to the reboot phase of your life." I smiled. Not long ago, I would have been mortified to say I was a divorced woman. I used to think being abandoned by a husband was the ultimate disgrace, a symbol of failure. But now all I wanted was to go back and give that younger version of me a good slap across the face. This isn't shameful. This isn't pitiful. This is freedom. "Congrats," Eleanor said again later that night, looping her arm around my shoulder as she walked through the door after work. "You've officially transformed into a modern, independent woman." She even recommended a job I could try. Something more creative, something mine. She encouraged me to start documenting my life after divorce, turning little pieces of my daily journey into videos and sharing them online. "Come on," she said with a laugh. "We've got to keep up with the times. Don't let the world leave you behind." With her support and encouragement, I took the first steps toward something I'd never imagined for myself. I created my first social media account. 1 month after my divorce, I posted my very first video on social media. Of course, Eleanor was the one who edited it. Honestly, it was the only version that looked halfway decent. Back then, I still stumbled over my words and looked painfully awkward in front of the camera. But now I can speak freely, looking straight into the lens without flinching, sharing my story without shame. I still carry a slight southern accent from my small-town roots, but I've stopped feeling self-conscious about it. That accent is part of who I am, and there's no reason to hide it. In the video, I sat in my kitchen with a warm smile, talking directly to the camera. "Welcome to Divorce Diaries by Aunt Jade. Let's take a look at what a day in the life of an independent woman born in the 60s looks like." Divorce Diaries was Eleanor's idea. She said it had just the right balance of humor and authenticity, something that would catch the eye of younger viewers. I never expected it to gain traction, but to my surprise, the video took off. That very first post received over 5,000 likes. Eleanor read the comments to me, grinning from ear to ear. "Jade Auntie's life is so real and comforting. There's something soft and healing about her presence. I swear I want to try her chicken noodle soup so badly." Internet mom goals. Eleanor chuckled. "You've got a fan base now. These young people are obsessed with your videos." So I kept going. I started posting more clips, little slices of my everyday life. Cooking, playing with the cat, cleaning the house, performing with the local community band, and even snippets from my adult education classes. That's right, I'd gone back to school. I never had the chance to complete my education when I was younger, but it's never too late to start. I signed up for adult enrichment courses at the local community college, slowly filling in the gaps I once thought would remain empty forever. To break up the routine, Eleanor dragged me along to her band rehearsals. "Music," she said, "is the best therapy there is." My videos became more diverse. No longer just glimpses of housework, but reflections of personal growth, healing, and the long, sometimes messy road back to myself. The chores I used to perform without thinking. peeling garlic, folding laundry, mopping the floor, suddenly became quiet metaphors resonating with people I'd never met. Somehow my ordinary life made others feel seen. One afternoon my phone rang. It was Caleb. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. This was the first time he'd reached out. "Mom, I saw your videos." There was a pause on the line, like he was choosing his words carefully. "You're putting yourself out there online, talking about the divorce and everything. I just thought, at your age, is that really necessary? I mean, if Dad sees it, he won't be thrilled." I felt my blood boil. I let out a sharp laugh. "Putting myself out there? What do you think I'm doing, committing a crime? Or are you just as clueless as your father?" There was a stunned silence on the other end. "I'm just worried about you," he mumbled. Then a beat later he added softly, "Liam misses you. He keeps asking why you don't come visit. And Dad's lost a lot of weight. He's not eating or sleeping well. Do you think there's still a chance for you two?" I snorted. "Don't be ridiculous." I already knew what was going on. Word travels fast in small circles. Harold and Vivian had already registered their marriage a few days ago. Newlyweds, glowing and in love, probably off on a honeymoon somewhere with matching bathrobes and wine glasses. Not eating, not sleeping. He was likely busy sipping champagne by the beach. I flipped through my recipe notes as I replied flatly, "Unless it's an emergency, don't call me again. I'm busy." I ended the call without another word and returned to my community college course catalog. Lately, I'd learned so much. Everything from advanced video editing to proper storytelling structure. I was finally reclaiming the time I'd once given away so freely, finally putting it towards something that felt like mine. Next on my list? Getting a new car. I was planning a road trip. Just me, the open highway, and the whole world waiting beyond the city lines. There's so much to see. And now, I finally have the freedom to go see it. I never expected to run into Harold again, let alone in a hospital. I had only come to pick up my routine checkup report. But just as I stepped into the lobby, I saw him, arm in arm with Vivian, walking toward me. I instinctively turned my head, planning to walk right past them like I hadn't seen a thing. But Vivian made sure that wouldn't happen. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" she called out sweetly. "Jade, what brings you to the hospital? Not feeling well?" As she spoke, she lifted her hand ever so casually, flashing the glint of a large diamond ring, making sure I couldn't miss it. She wanted me to see it, to know that they'd officially tied the knot. I gave her a brief glance, then turned my eyes to Harold. For a second his expression faltered. A flicker of panic crossed his face, small but noticeable. "Are you okay?" he asked quickly. "Did you see a doctor? How have you been?" Vivian stood beside him, her forced smile stretching tight across her face. One of those expressions that looked more like a wince than a grin. "I'm fine, thank you," I said flatly. Then I walked past them without another word. As the elevator doors closed behind me, a chill ran through me, not from nostalgia but from clarity. Cold, steady clarity. I wasn't shaken. I wasn't sad. I was more certain than ever. I had made the right choice. Upstairs, I headed to the medical office to collect my results. Dr. Alan Fisher was already flipping through my report when I walked in. He glanced up, eyes scanning me for a moment. "Well, from the numbers, you're in excellent health," he said with a warm smile. "Actually, you look better than ever, glowing even. Your skin looks brighter, your energy's better. I'd say the divorce suits you." He chuckled. "I hear you've been doing some kind of lifestyle videos online? My wife's a huge fan. She follows you religiously, says she wants to start her own channel now." I nodded. "It's just a little something to keep my days in rhythm. I've got time, and a young friend encouraged me to give it a try." I never expected it to get so much attention. But then Alan's smile faded, his tone shifting. "Is it really over between you and Harold?" He hesitated, then added, "From the way he looked earlier, I don't know. I don't think he's over you." He leaned back, sighing. "He hasn't been in great shape lately. Age is catching up with him, he's slowing down, and it's starting to show." I paused, unsure what to say. Harold had a new life now. I had mine. We had drifted so far apart it felt like we lived in separate worlds. And still, people tried to weave our names back together again, as if it were possible to stitch old chapters into a new book. Why do people do that? Why do they keep trying to piece together a story that's already ended? Why insist that two people who have already gone their separate ways should somehow find their way back again? People from our generation always say, don't break it, fix it. They think staying together is the noble thing, the right thing, the only thing. But today's younger generation understands something better. Sometimes the truest kindness is letting go. Sometimes walking away is the most dignified closure you can give each other. I sat quietly for a moment, then said softly but firmly, times have changed, Alan. When love no longer fits, you don't keep wearing it out of habit. I'm not going back to Harold. That chapter's over. Alan rubbed the bridge of his nose, clearly a little embarrassed by how firmly I'd shut it down. You're right, he murmured. I just wanted to see you happy again. We've been neighbors so long, it's hard not to care. Then, after a beat of hesitation, he added quietly, but, Jade, this time Harold really is sick. Sometimes fate really does have the cruelest sense of humor. Harold, who once faked Alzheimer's just to push me away, had now been truly diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. When Alan told me, I simply shrugged. So what? Taking care of Harold wasn't my responsibility anymore. That role had long been passed on to someone who supposedly belonged there now. I didn't have time for sympathy, much less nostalgia. I had continuing education classes to attend, driving lessons to schedule, content to film, and videos to edit for my social media page. But just as I was finally throwing myself wholeheartedly into my new life, the storm hit. It started small, just a few bitter comments under my videos. At first, I could laugh them off as I read them aloud to Eleanor, trying to stay detached. This so-called sweet homemaker is just another clout chaser riding the divorce wave. I used to know her from our old town. Trust me, she was always a mess, constantly clinging to her ex-husband. Don't be fooled by her innocent act. She's not who she pretends to be. Always scheming, always after other people's men. I tried to keep my composure. I really did. I thought they were just a few toxic voices shouting into the void. But the next few days proved me wrong. More people began piling on, strangers, followers, trolls. The comment section turned into a mob scene full of slurs and accusations. Some even messaged me privately, hurling vile words I'd never imagined strangers would dare to say. It was vicious. Merciless. I'd never seen anything like it. The same people who once found comfort in my warmth and daily routines now flipped overnight, as if they'd been handed a new script to read from, a new villain to hate. I stopped uploading. Even logging into my account made my chest tighten. I hovered over the delete account button more than once. Eleanor noticed right away. Furious, she slammed her phone down and said, "No way. We're not letting them do this to you." She immediately started digging, determined to trace the origin of the smear campaign. Eventually she found it. A post from a so-called women's empowerment account. Anonymous submissions, tear-soaked stories meant to tug at people's hearts. And buried there was a letter that lit the match. I lost my lover to a woman who trapped him for years. Even after fate finally brought us back together, she refused to let go. She uses their divorce as publicity, uploading videos of her new life, just to lure him back in. He's worn out, underweight, emotionally drained, and I ask myself every day, how much more can I take? Below the post, commenters began linking my social media account, not by name but by suggestion. Some tagged me directly. Others left subtle breadcrumbs, fueling the fire. Then came the so-called insiders. You know that woman with the videos? Her ex-husband has Alzheimer's and she's exploiting it for attention. And just like that, a lie snowballed into a narrative. A single line, "Her ex has Alzheimer's and she's still loyally caring for him," became a viral soundbite. Comment sections flooded with emotional replies. My mom took care of my grandpa during late-stage Alzheimer's. It broke her. My grandfather wandered out of the house every night. It's the hardest thing in the world. That woman is amazing. But they weren't praising me. They were praising a ghost version of me, a fabricated figure molded by Vivian's narrative. A weeping, long-suffering wife, twisted into a tragic background character to justify her presence. Me, the real me, I was erased from my own story. Drowned beneath public sympathy for a lie. They turned me into a villain in someone else's love story. Are you going to respond to all these rumors? Eleanor asked, her tone cautious but firm. I didn't have an answer right away. Not long after, Caleb showed up at my door in person. The moment he stepped inside, he started urging me not to respond publicly. "Mom, just let it go," he said, trying to sound calm. "These online things blow over quickly. If you stir the pot, it'll only create more noise. It might even hurt the company's image, impact the stock price." I turned and looked at him, but before I could speak, Nina tugged his sleeve and shot him a sharp glance. "Can you please think about what you're saying and where you're saying it?" she hissed under her breath, clearly embarrassed. She hesitated for a moment, then turned to me and spoke more gently. "Jade, I honestly didn't expect Vivian to stoop this low. She's always preaching that the unloved one is the true outsider," she added bitterly. "What a joke." There was a pause and then she murmured, "If I had known who she really was, I'd never have let Liam call her grandma." She caught herself, realizing she'd said too much, and fell awkwardly silent. I didn't reply. It sighed, long and heavy. "You should leave now," I said quietly. "And don't come back." I had made up my mind. Caleb saw it in my face and left with a defeated look. 3 days later I logged into my account again, and this time I posted a video. For the first time I faced the camera, not to share a recipe or a quiet moment of my day, but to speak the truth. The video opened with me sitting at my kitchen table. I looked straight into the lens, my voice calm and measured. "Hi everyone, I'm Jade. Today I want to take a moment to address some of the things being said about me online. Some say I'm a typical housewife, that I lack education, that I don't know how to dress, that my life once revolved entirely around my husband and child. And to be honest, that used to be true. But then one day my husband started pulling away. Later he was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. It's not a terminal illness, but it does take patience, lots of it, to care for someone going through that. At first I believed it was just part of marriage, standing by each other, growing old together. But eventually I realized he wasn't really sick. It was all a lie, a performance meant to push me into filing for divorce. He said I was too plain, too unrefined, not educated enough. 36 years of marriage, and just like that he was ready to walk away. Our marriage certificate was issued 6 years ago. Our divorce, less than a year old. And now he's remarried. I held up the court-issued divorce decree for the camera to see, forcing a small, awkward smile. I'm not asking for sympathy. I just think every person who's been silenced deserves to be heard. My throat tightened as I spoke those words. That old wound, buried so deeply, had cracked open again, but I knew this moment was necessary. I had to reclaim my voice. When the video went live, the comment section stayed quiet for a long while. Then slowly the tide began to shift. People began digging into the timeline, cross-checking facts, questioning the stories they'd been fed. Some even found old photographs and shared them online. "I'm a travel photographer," one user posted. "Over the years I captured this same couple in different cities." Turns out, that was Harold and Vivian. There they were, hand in hand, smiling in cafes, strolling down unfamiliar streets, leaning into each other like lovers in a postcard. Those business trips Harold used to take? Just romantic getaways with someone else. Even Ella, the community worker who used to help clean the house, chimed in. I always thought something felt off. Harold wasn't sick. That winter when he locked Jade out in the snow, he didn't look like a man with Alzheimer's. He looked like someone putting on a show. As more and more people came forward, the narrative unraveled. The sympathy shifted. The truth surfaced. The tide turned. People no longer saw me as a manipulative ex-wife or a fame-hungry homemaker. They saw me for who I really was. A woman who had been lied to, betrayed, and discarded, yet somehow still found the strength to rise. And Harold and Vivian? Their perfect image shattered. The words betrayal, manipulation, and publicity stunt clung to them like stains they couldn't scrub away. That's when I received 2 unexpected messages from my blocked contacts. One was from Caleb. "Mom, I'm sorry. Please come home." The other, shockingly, was from Harold himself. "Jade, I'm sorry. I'll end this marriage." I stared at the screen for a long time. And then slowly I put the phone down. Because this time, finally, truly and completely, I wasn't going back. After the chaos of the divorce finally settled, a few old friends began calling me one by one. Some were filled with sighs and regret,